The Chicago Freedom Movement, also known as the Chicago Open Housing Movement, was led by Martin Luther King Jr., James Bevel, and Al Raby. It was supported by the Chicago-based Coordinating Council of Community Organizations and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The Chicago Freedom Movement was one of the major forces that led to the passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act in 1968. Though this was not the only impact of the campaign, there are many lessons housing advocates today that can learn from the work of Dr. King and the Chicago residents.
The Chicago Freedom Movement, led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., James Bevel, and Al Raby, was created to challenge domestic racial segregation and discrimination in Chicago and its suburbs. King led demonstrations against segregation in education and housing, as well as employment discrimination. According to HOLC, it states 11 million Americans, 10,852,727 live in once redlined areas, according to the latest population data from the Census Bureau's American Survey 2017. Because of these people that live in redline neighborhoods are segregated and have worse living conditions from the people in higher income neighborhoods.
Many things contributed to our world being a lot better than it was in the past, and the Chicago Freedom Movement was one of them. Not that long ago, black people would be violently kicked out of their homes if they lived in a white neighborhood. Though there are less racist people, life is still hard for black people as systemic racism is instilled into our judicial system.
The younger family is forced to live in a house that is too small, and that is evident throughout the story because all their things are cluttered because they don't have anywhere to put them. The youngers are in a redlined community, and the Chicago Freedom Movement was one of the many steps towards equality between African American people and people who already lived in America. By bringing around about the Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968, this act would make it easier for the youngers to live and thrive in a better community.
In conclusion, the Chicago Freedom Movement had many effects on the world. The Chicago Freedom Movement was meant to spread their campaign of equality across America. They wanted to spread it all over the South to end racism in these areas. This protest was led by Martin Luther King, one of the most famous activists during this time. People during the 60s had a bias against black people, so in retaliation, black people led the Chicago Freedom Movement to end the systematic racism in the South. Overall, housing discrimination has had a great deal on our nation and has limited many minority people from having a better life because of these unfair and unjust housing laws. What we can do to fight back and to help is by attending peaceful protests because this issue is still present in today's society.
Redlining is when financial officers draw red lines on parts of a map around areas they did not want to invest in based on the poverty level. They redlined areas that had black people because they thought that it was a waste of money to give loans to them. This was due because they thought that black people could not pay off the debt.
Redlining started in 1934, beginning with the National Housing Act. The government had created a system to increase and segregate housing in America. African Americans and other people of color were put into urban housing communities, but the Federal Housing Administration refused to insure mortgages in and around these communities.
Connects to Raisin in the Sun because there is a man, Carl Linder, who is a landlord. Started off as nice, but further into the conversation, Carl asked them if the people in the neighborhood off of them because the neighborhood does not want people of color moving in to their neighborhood and will do anything. This means that the people in the neighborhood would rather have a house with no tenants in their neighborhood than have a black family move into it. This shows redlining in the Raisin in the Sun.
Redlining is still happening today. You can see this by going to a low-income neighborhood. You most likely will not see a white person, but a minority like a black or Hispanic person, or people. And this is showing that non-white people are treated with less respect. They also don't get the money they deserve, which causes them to live in these low-income neighborhoods, which results in bad futures for themselves and their children.
Exactly happening today. Some people of color still face housing discrimination where they are denied loans or housing because of their race. One way we can try to stop this is by reporting any signs of housing discrimination. For example, if a real estate agent says something like, "I don't think this would be a good fit," that could be a sign that they are trying to keep you in a certain place. If you think you're being discriminated against, you can reach out to the Fair Housing Justice Center and they can help you.
The white flight is an event when people move to a different place just to avoid diversity in the area. The white flight started in the 1950s and 1960s. There is not much of it today, but some examples of the white flight are in the Raisin in the Sun too.
Past of the white flight. In the past, we have had the white flight. The white flight was an often occurrence in the 50s and the 60s. During this time period, most other races besides white people started to move into other neighborhoods. As a result, most white families decided to move out of their current neighborhoods due to they didn't want to be around other people. This to them was a sign of protesting and freedom, although what they were really doing was endorsing racism and segregation. To add on, in this time period, segregation only became worse because other races moved into the white people's homes or areas, so they became mad and basically left, which was creating segregation between the two communities. Some people say that the white flight never disappeared, it evolved and adapted. Now people say it moved to the suburbs or other places. This is the history of the white flight. Overall, the white flight was an event of migration based off the race which occurred back in the 50s and the 60s.
White flight is extremely connected to the book/play, right? A Raisin in the Sun. This can be proven in page 43 when Mama is saying, "I ain't no white woman," and talking about taking a trip, because it is harder for other races to enjoy themselves because they don't have the money to. The reason Mom is also comparing herself to a white woman is because the family cannot afford such things, and people of other races have less of a chance because they have less to start with. Another example of this can be shown on page 119. Page 119 states, "While people can get awfully worked up when they feel their whole way of life and everything they've ever worked for is threatened, in my opinion, this is a clear example of white flight." Linder is stating that white people feel violated and threatened. If so, the younger family moves in, the neighbors will move out. So clearly, in a Raisin in the Sun, the white flight can be seen, which connects back to the fact that the white flight and Raisin in the Sun have a connection.
Is white flight still happening? White flight, or white exodus, is a sudden or gradual large-scale migration of white people from areas becoming more racially or ethnoculturally diverse. Starting in the 1950s and 1960s, the terms became popular in the United States. Although the Great White Flight was an event, was not a common occurrence, this thing still happens in neighborhoods and towns today. When a white person moves out of a neighborhood, they will move to a new place with primarily other white people, leaving black people or other minorities at the old neighborhood. As this happens over and over again, it leaves neighborhoods very segregated and not diverse. This is a huge problem because if neighborhoods only have one race, black and white people, they will not learn to peacefully coexist.
It is important that we all tolerate and coexist with one another so that nobody feels unliked, especially if it's because of something they cannot control, such as race. The white flight movement from the 50s to the 60s was an example of people not coexisting, and it was an example of racism in our society. This year we have seen many negative things happen to the black community, and it's up to us to make a change. Even if it isn't through migration, racism is prominent in the United States today, and if we want to progress as a nation, we cannot be held back by race.
Gentrification is when wealthier people move into poorer neighborhoods. It's supposed to help bring business to lower income neighborhoods. However, gentrification typically hurts the poor people in the neighborhood. The lower income families are forced to move out because prices of housing and groceries have risen. Gentrification has been happening for many years, and places like Chicago and New York have it, and people are also separated based on their income.
Gentrification is when people who are higher class move into a neighborhood that isn't wealthy. This would help the neighborhood become wealthy by improving the neighborhood. Gentrification had a huge impact in the past. An example is that people were kicked out of their homes in their neighborhood. Because of this, they tried to make the neighborhood wealthy. Mostly African Americans were kicked out and had nowhere to go. This would mostly happen in large cities. In some cities, gentrification have accelerated greatly. Since 2000, approximately 20% of communities with lower living standards and family values have experienced gentrification compared with 9% in the 1990s. Since the 2000 census, gentrification is still not widespread globally. Because of 8% of the neighborhood have considered gentrification.
And connects to racism and so on, because now that the family can move into a nicer and bigger house, they will be living in an area where there is a much higher rate of white people, and in those areas the homes are a lot less money, but they're bigger and nicer. Therefore, the white people living there have affordable housing and they're able to raise big families. But in the areas where there's more black people, they don't get the loans and the money, so they're living in smaller, cramped areas, and they're paying even more for the house. And that shows also racial discrimination and preferences.
Gentrification causes economic discrimination, makes only the top moneymakers to thrive, while everyone else is pushed into a box of the same economic value. Gentrification is happening everywhere, and you might not notice it. It happens most in smaller and less fancy neighborhoods, but it also happens in places like the Upper West Side, which are prominently white. They cause everything in that neighborhood to rise in price. This is because rich people buy the buildings and houses and turn them into fancy condos, causing the economics of that neighborhood to rise too. Eventually, people who cannot afford this will have to move out, causing children to be raised in neighborhoods of people with the same economic background. Therefore, at every chance, people should fight those who buy buildings and turn them into condos, causing gentrification and discrimination of economic backgrounds.